Hey everyone, Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio, every afternoon at 12 noon Eastern Time. Merle Temple is my guest, and Merle is an author of many books, a whole series of books. His latest, Deputy, Once Upon a Time in Mississippi. These novels are written as fiction, but drawn from his experiences as a deputy sheriff, an agent in the first drug wars, quote unquote, the first captain in the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, a manager in the corporate world, a campaign chairman in the political wars, and an evangelist in prison. Merle, is there anything you haven't done?
Well, people compare me to Forrest Gump.
I can see why. Your fictional books, which are dramatic, which are exciting books, and which are increasingly being read by college English classes and by younger people, where you're reaching a wider audience and you're having a great influence. They do, as you say, draw from your life experiences. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that and where you're coming from. First, in your involvement in back in the day in law enforcement, with the influx of drug gangs into the United States and also domestic drug gangs. Talk a little bit about that and how you got started in that.
Well, I was coming out of Ole Miss just about the time that President Nixon declared the first so-called war on drugs, and the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics was created, modeled after the DEA, and they were young and weren't many agents, and I decided that must be the place for me, and we set forth to save the world, and found out, it's a very complex problem. But I went into the Bureau, worked undercover. In the early days, often we worked solo undercover. And if you got in trouble, the posse wasn't going to come and rescue you because there just wasn't one in those days. And so I was held hostage by heroin dealers down in South Mississippi. They lured me out to this little shack out in the middle of nowhere about midnight, scene out of every bad B horror movie, if you could see it. And when I went in the house, one put a pistol in my forehead, the other one put a shotgun in my stomach. And they decided that they would just kill me because they knew I had money and keep their heroin. And that began a long night that night where one sat across from me. His eyes never leaving mine. He put the old double-edged razor blades into his mouth. He bit down on the razor blades, chewed it, broke it, and swallowed it. And then he grinned at me, and blood just gushed from his mouth, bubbled up at each corner of his mouth, streamed down on his throat, oozed between his teeth. And then he put his hand back up in his mouth, got a handful of blood, and said, "Want some?" So I don't believe I'd care for any. And then he got a whole box of long stem kitchen matches, and he lit all of them and bent over the flame, and there was blood running from his mouth. And then he put his head back and swallowed the whole flame.
Oh my God!
It was at that moment my whole life flashed before my eyes, and I really began to see images buried in my subconscious of me as a toddler, my parents, and things like that. And that I couldn't consciously recall. I told people later that it really was quite a beautiful experience, but I wouldn't recommend the stimulus, that it took to trigger it. And
I don't think so.
Got out of that. Won't go into too much detail. It's all in Ghostly Shade of Pale, which is our most famous book, and out of the four, and the one that Criminal Minds read in Hollywood when they called me to Hollywood to represent me. I signed for their cast, and but after that, I made an investigator, uncovered a plot by organized crime to move down into DeSoto County, Mississippi, and create what really was kind of another version of what happened in McNairy County, in the famous Pusser stories. And some of those guys from McNairy actually were involved in that syndicate along with the Dixie Mafia and the St. Louis Mafia family. And we didn't tell anybody that we were coming in. We investigated for a long time, and we raided one of the main clubs that they had when they were all there. And because they had bought off so much of local government. We didn't tell anybody we were coming in. And so we filled up the jail, and then they were very unhappy. And the informant called me and told me that all the factions were meeting. And I said, what are they meeting about? And they said, we're pooling their money and deciding who they're going to hire to kill you. And I said, oh, they're not going to do that. I said, the wrath of God would come down on them. If to murder an estate agent, there'd be no place to hide. So no, they're serious. And I was young then and thought I would live forever, and still a little naive in many ways. And right after that, I got a call. A guy from Memphis wanted to meet me. He said, I can give you what you missed in that big raid and investigation. And so I told my wife then that I was going to meet an informant, didn't tell her where. And I felt kind of bad about it. He wanted to meet out in the woods somewhere. And I said, no, we're not going to meet out in the woods. I'll meet you right by the interstate at Horn Lake. And right after I left, my informant called and said, is Merle there? And she said, no, he's gone. And she said, get a hold of him and tell him it's a setup. They're going to kill him, and hung up. Well, my police radio had gone out. So when the highway patrol tried to radio me, they couldn't reach me. I got there, had my gun tucked down underneath my belt, took it out of my shoulder holster and closed my jacket over it. I got there and there were not one, but two waiting on me, and I should have driven off. And Jim Clemente at Criminal Minds fussed at me and said, what were you thinking? And I said, well, Jim, I was young and I didn't want to miss anything. I thought I could handle it, but it deteriorated pretty quickly and got down to just everybody holding their guns and saying, you first, no, you first. And I got out of that, and then became supervisor and captain. We've done heroin deals off some heroin dealers who were flooding the Golden Triangle, Mississippi State area, Mississippi State College for Women, flooding the area with high-grade, very highly addictive heroin. And they'd create an addict market, Chuck, for very pure heroin. And they would come in when they'd done that, and they would cut the purity and drive up their profits. And so we'd made several buys off of them. We decided to do a big buy bust, we called it, for a large amount of drugs and try to draw out any backers they had who wouldn't trust them with that much product. And we couldn't let that amount of money walk away in those days. And so we set that up in Columbus, Mississippi, and I was leaving my headquarters in Tupelo to go to Starkville to meet the agents at the Holiday Inn and set up the parameters of the deal. And when I ran down to my car, Chuck, jumped in my car, cranked up, put my hand on the gear shift. When I did, the Spirit filled up my car, wrapped all around me, all through me. Never experienced anything like that in my life. Scared me to death. I didn't know what that was. It was in every molecule of my body, and told me to go back and get the bulletproof vest, and then it was gone. Well, no one wore vests in those days. Everybody does now. We had two for the north half of the state, no armor in them. They stopped maybe a small handgun, and they just didn't like to wear them, and especially undercover. And I thought, well, I don't know where that's coming from. I'm losing my mind. Put my hand back on the gear shift again. The Spirit filled up my car, and it wasn't optional. Go back and get the vest. I said, okay. Got the vest, met the agents, convinced them to wear them. They didn't want to. Told them, I said, keep the deal in Columbus, or we'll have buildings to hide behind. It's kind of tough to surveil somebody out on a flat plane when, the bad guy will say, hey, who are those guys down there? But the deal got away from them. They left downtown, went out south of Columbus, and got on this high levee road, deep depressions on either side, going off into the swamp. And it was a desolate place, and it was just a dark day. It's rolling charcoal clouds. It was an ominous day. It looked like faces forming in the sky. Later that night, it froze everything from Jackson, Mississippi to Corinth in a sheet of ice. And they stopped up on the levee. We got as close as we could on both sides, listening onto a little body mic. And they walked down the slope of the hill to negotiate the deal. And what we didn't know was right through the depths of the swampy area, there was a railroad that ran through and intersected with the levee road. And of course, there was a high trestle there in that low place. And right where the trestle joined into the levee road, there was a clump of pine trees, and that's where they had the sniper. And he was posted up there with a high-powered rifle. And then we listened to the deal, and it started going down, and they said, "You're under arrest." And then it cut out, and my heart was in my throat. And when it popped back on, I heard ta-da, ta ta ta. You know, he was opening fire, and a terrible gun battle ensued. We came across the levee, caught in the crossfire. Female agent radioed me and told me her partner had been hit bad, and she had just shot one of the violators. I'll cut the story a little bit. And later, when I left the scene in charge of the chief of intelligence and went to the hospital and saw her, tried to comfort her. She was 21, looked about 80, you know, when I saw her because of that stress. And arrested the violator she had wounded who'd come there for treatment. And walked into the ER, and there was my friend and agent. They were cutting his clothes off of him, and that white bulletproof vest that God had sent me back to get was now crimson soaked in blood. And when I walked up, the doctor said, "Merle, look at this." One round hit him in his lower extremities, one sliced through his right arm, and this one hit him right in the chest. He said it penetrated the vest because it wasn't designed to stop a high-powered rifle, but it deflected it. So it went in behind his right breast, skittered around the barrel of his rib cage, and popped out behind his left breast. He said, "Merle, if he hadn't had that vest on, it had taken out his heart and lungs, and he would have been dead before he hit the ground." And I tell you, Chuck, you could almost hear and feel the shuffle of angels' feet around us that day. And so those are just a few highlights of what happened, and not to mention the internal affairs investigation of a corrupt governor and wiretapping me and threats and all kind of other shenanigans.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a difficult and traumatic story to recount. I mean, it's unbelievable, but yet, you know, you're right out there in the front of it. And one of the things that strikes me about this, Merle, is that, and it occurs to me, is that the people that you were battling on the streets, the evil people, the street level criminals who, you know, were really like in it to make the money and who were the kind of the strong arm side of the house, they were to varying degrees in cahoots with government people, elected officials, bureaucrats. I mean, they couldn't do it if they weren't. You know, that's part of how they would enter into a community. I mean, there's certainly a lot of that went on here in Boston, we know about. I mean, where I am, and probably anywhere, where you have the corruption it's kind of like a scissors effect. The lower blade is the street people, who are the thugs and the real strong, you know, operators. And the upper blade are the people who are operating out of boardrooms and operating in, you know, city halls and governor's offices and, you know, in the towers, who are benefiting from it, who are at least turning a blind eye to it, who have some implicit responsibility in terms of allowing it to function. And that one blade doesn't do anything without the other blade. They both have to come down in order to make it happen. So when you're out there battling these people on the streets, you're battling two blades. I mean, you're also battling the government that you think is supposed to be there to have your back and really protect you and help you. And you don't always know who is who in that world because, you know, it's omerta, you know, it's silence. I mean, you can't know who in the government has been corrupted by this and who's involved in it. So that really strikes me in this way. And you say that you actually got to the point where when you got into this sort of the white collar side of the house, you took on a corrupt governor. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, you're spot on about what you said. And, you know, when I was captain, I didn't trust anybody. I couldn't because the lives of my agents depended on me. And I knew so many people would compromise. It's like the old line from X-Files, you know, trust no one, Mr. Mulder. And that was the kind of rule that we played by. And even in those days, we would be watching airfields. We had so many small airfields in Mississippi, crop dusters and private planes, and we would watch those late into the night because intelligence agencies of our own government, were hiring mercenary pilots to fly guns into Central and South America, whatever side we were supporting at the time. And, and the problem was that they didn't come back empty. They came back loaded with drugs. And
right.
The only question was, was it sanctioned or not? And often we believed it was sanctioned to fund black operations. And the governor we dealt with, I was picked to run an internal affairs investigation on somebody that was forced into our agency, disqualifying, 25, 30 people above that person on the merit system list. And he had a checkered past and couldn't pass the background investigation anyway. And that leaked to the Clarion Ledger and the big newspaper in Jackson. And an investigation was demanded. And they picked me because they said the press, trusted me and thought I was a straight arrow. And it was a tough investigation. They tampered with my witnesses. This person had abused some young girls, and I went to 3 states to interview girls who were now young women. And it was, I hated that I had to put them back through that, but they were eager to tell their story until one of them got a call from the governor's office and wouldn't talk to me anymore because they were afraid.
Yeah, sure.
And I called headquarters from the road and told the director to tell the governor's office if they tampered with my witnesses again, that I would resign and call a news conference and just give the press everything that I had. And the governor was getting ready to run for the Senate then, and he didn't want that. And so they admitted it. But they agreed to stop. And we won that battle. But then after that, I was directly in the crosshairs, and, they set out to get me. And, and the chief of intelligence and we wouldn't even talk. Primitive technology back then, Chuck, but we had little boxes in our desk. And my friend, the chief of intelligence, who was about the only person I truly trusted, he, a former intelligence officer in Vietnam, he'd call me and he'd say, like, Delta 9. And I'd say, hang on a second. And I'd pull out that box as a scrambling device. And I put my receiver down into it, pick up the other receiver, and I'd dial D9. And then anybody who was wiretapping us, all I could hear was garble. And that's just the world that we lived in. And it was a harbinger of things to come for me in the future when I had to leave the Bureau and went into the corporate world and found out that the organized crime figures, who tried to kill me were just choir boys compared to the corporate and government gangsters and what I call the unholy trinity of politics, crime, and business. And because they got the power of full government to bring to bear some threatening telephone calls, and even from a newspaper editor who told me, that I could not support a certain candidate against the corrupt incumbent. And he said, "We made you in the papers, and we can break you." And that's jarring stuff when I tell these stories to people who are naive and they're sheltered. They just don't know how the real world really operates, and it's jolting or jarring, I guess, to their paradigm. But that's part of my mission. I go out and tell people how the world really is, how dangerous it is, and how many people have made that Faustian deal, to rule on hell and earth rather than to serve eternally in heaven.
It's it's the way of the world. I mean, it's obviously makes sense. It's difficult to talk about, but certainly when we're looking at the kind of money that's involved, the kind of gain that's involved here, then of course there's going to be corruption. And then it's going to take as you say, the tripartite, the government, business, and the street criminals. And that if nothing is done, if it's not challenged, then it becomes institutionalized after a while. I mean, we could take a look at certain smaller countries in the world. Central America comes to mind, South America, where you have the corruption has become so institutional that it's ingrained. It's part of life. At least in this country, we have some hope of challenging it through, our system of limited government and our different avenues of power. I mean, the founding fathers set up checks and balances for this very reason. They understood that government can be corrupted and then it has to be checked and balanced. And, when you talk about these issues, I mean, it's kind of almost overwhelming to think about because, the idea of these airstrips with drugs coming in, these people, I mean, it's so evil that the government would do this. They get our American citizens hooked on these substances to make a buck, and then they keep them hooked on the substances, and they never get off of them, and it becomes like both a means to make tons of money illicitly, but also then to expand the size of government to deal with the social problems that they've created, and then everybody gets paid to do that. So, the corruption is there on a lot of levels. Not to bring up a subject, obviously, but being in radio, you read articles and hear rumors about things. And when you talk about the airstrips, it makes me think about the Mina airstrip in Arkansas with Bill Clinton. I don't know if you know about that, but, there you have a governor who, I don't want to say he's corrupt with a capital C, but, there's a pretty well-known trail of shady dealings on the part of the Clintons. Always one little step ahead of the law. Very crafty lawyers who know how to do things, just operating within the technical legal definition of the law, and all for self-interest, and they get away with it because they genuflect to the left. People like they're progressive, so people are willing to look the other way and ignore the amount of ill-gotten benefits that they've received throughout their careers. And I think that they're probably a mild example, and this isn't a partisan thing. I'm sure there's just as many conservative Republicans who were just as bad. And I don't think that they are as bad as some. But it does kind of stand as an example of how, this, corruption, the street money, the drug money, who knows what else they're selling, probably children, that it corrupts government, right? I mean, it leads to, the money flows and suddenly people, people respond to that. They're willing to play ball. And you've kind of, taken a peek under the hood a little bit here, both personally with your work, you're going out, and also now you're recounting it in fictional form in your series of books, which should be read with an understanding of who you are. They're not just making this stuff up. You're out there. You know the score. I mean, you know what's going on, and you know a lot more than you're probably even telling us.
Yeah, I do. It's when I first went out with a ghostly shade of pale, some people were a little shocked, especially here in Mississippi. They said, "That kind of stuff happens here in Mississippi?" I said, "Oh yeah, all the time." And this is not just in Chicago or LA or New York or Miami. Right.
That's a thought that came to my mind too. Here you have a pretty relatively solid part of the country. I mean, it's not the mafia running around, but it's everywhere.
Yeah, we actually, I don't know if you remember Carlos Marcello. He was the most powerful godfather in the country at one time, and linked to the assassination plots.
Kennedy.
Both Kennedys, and he hated them because Bobby deported him, and one time they dropped him and his henchmen off in the Guatemalan jungles to walk out or die. And that's a tough thing to do to somebody whose favorite saying is 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead. And so he came to about midnight one night. He drove up from New Orleans. We'd gotten a tip, and he drove up from New Orleans and drove straight downtown and went into the governor's mansion at midnight. Spent 2 hours with the governor.
Ooh, that's yeah. I mean, we're talking high level, corruption here. I mean, criminals.
The thing you see in The Cover of Darkness, shock most people that the things that we see. We'd be out on surveillance and watching suspects and before they came up for that meeting to set it up, you know, they sent up some of the soldiers from New Orleans and took out another high-ranking official in government to the Jackson Country Club to kind of pave the way for that second meeting. And so, you know, no, I got to where in life nothing surprises me anymore. I've seen the best and the worst of humanity, and I just try to warn people that it's a dark and dangerous world, and especially around politicians, I warn them that, you know, a lot of people you think are good and godly people are not. Once they got your money and your votes, you know, they may quote scripture to you, you know, they may pray with you.
This. Yeah, I mean, I've seen it firsthand when I ran for Congress. They'd have the Bible in one hand and they'd have the other hand shoved into your pocket.
That's right. And the minute you leave, they mock you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very, very troubling. Now, you know, I'm worried about some of the higher levels of government and whether or not they've been corrupted and to what degree they may have been corrupted. And I'm specifically talking about the FBI. Now, I don't think that we're looking today at the same FBI that was presided over by J. Edgar Hoover, which I think really meant business. I do think they went after the mob. They went after communists. They went after Nazis. You know, they went after the Ku Klux Klan. They infiltrated it and basically through agents, and they were able to basically undo it as a force. They did the same with the Black Panthers. In a way, they were doing real police work, I should say. But I'm concerned that it's become like a political entity now. And I'm particularly talking about the tenure of James Comey and his predecessor, Bob Mueller, who were not really FBI agents. They really were not law enforcement. They were political hacks. You know, they were lawyers. And it looks like they were serving a political agenda when they were able to arrange, you know, a FISA court to agree to allow them to spy on a presidential candidate, that being Donald Trump, with this kind of cooked up dossier and all this stuff. And I guess that, you know, it concerns me, you know. I mean, do we have, you know, such an important agency at a highest level? Has it become so corrupted that it's able to get away with this and spy on Americans and go after people, raid people's offices, you know, charge people with a ton of crimes? I mean, just the level of political corruption, it reminds me of what you'd see in a third world country. What do you think? Merle? Okay, we seem to be having a little bit of a computer freeze here. Well, speak up when you can, Merle. Sorry about that. Technology is technology. Anyway, my guest is Merle Temple, and he's lived a very colorful life. I mean, this is powerful stuff. He was held hostage by drug dealers near Tylertown, and contract assassins hired by the Dixie Mafia tried to kill him near Memphis. We heard him talk about that. Merle and his team were ambushed by a sniper in a terrible gun battle near Columbus, the day of dramatic intervention by God. We heard him talk about that. That says treachery and betrayal ran all the way to the front door of the White House, and the last of the Boy Scouts was indicted and sent to federal prison. But it was that nightmare that God used his megaphone of pain to shout at Merle, "Can you hear me now?" Dramatic story. You know, this is the kind of stuff that on the surface sounds fictional, but it's in his case, it's not fictional. It's quite real. Anyway, it looks like we're having a bit of a computer freeze, so I'm going to have Merle back for at least one, if not a series of follow-up interviews as we go on. The books are available at Amazon.com. His latest is Deputy is where is it? Deputy, Deputy is his latest. He's also the author of A Ghostly Shade of Pale, A Rented World, The Redeemed, and other excellent series. The Michael Parker series, presently his books are being pitched to Hollywood producers, and I hope they get picked up there because they are important books, they're exciting books, and sometimes a cultural presentation like this can have a lot more political impact than just a dry, factual story. Anyway, Merle Temple, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. I shall return the usual time tomorrow at 12 noon, right here at live at Facebook and at YouTube. Chuck Morse, you can check out my books, including my newest book, Assassination in America, available at Amazon. Thanks for watching, everybody.